Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LCK week number 7 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. We are getting closer and closer to playoffs when it comes to the LCK. Playoffs are starting up basically everywhere else in the world right now. The LPL essentially just kicked off their playoffs with the play-in stage. Of course, you can check out my coverage of that on this channel, and you can also check out my coverage of every single week of the LCK leading into this. That's going to be linked up in the iCard right now. You can check that out if you are interested. Today, we're going to be going over all 10 series that we got here in week number 7, as per usual. A lot of interesting things to clear up. The top of the standings, in my opinion, is a lot more interesting here in summer than it was in spring in the LCK, and especially with, a lot on the line for a lot of these teams, there is a lot to fight for, some very interesting matchups. So if you are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. If you are new here, what we are going to do in this video is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover, and at the end of the video, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, also be updating my personal power rankings at the end of this video, but right now, things are very difficult. A lot of the top teams in the LCK feel pretty volatile, which is something that we really haven't said in a long while. It's usually felt like, yes, all the top LCK teams are very good, but we kind of knew the order that they were going to be going in. Not so much so far in this summer split, which I think has made things a lot more interesting, at least for me in particular. So, without further ado, let's get into what I was talking about, and that definitely kicks off on day number 1. Our first series of week number 7 is certainly a telling one. It's T1 taking on Dplus KIA. And T1 is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. This team has, I'm not going to say been in freefall mode ever since coming back from the Esports World Cup, but they've certainly not looked like T1. They have almost completely fallen off in terms of their consistency. They've lost multiple times to teams that they really have no business losing to. Most importantly, 2 series losses to Hanwha Life Esports. That's just not good. That's not a good spot for you to be in if you are T1, because that's the team that you're probably competing with for the number 2 spot in the LCK right now. And it's not like DK has been too far off. They actually have an 8-4 record. They've looked pretty good over the course of this split, a better record than T1. Unfortunately for DK, they just didn't have enough firepower in this series. This was essentially a 3-0 in favor of T1. This was them kind of being better in all 3 games. DK ends up making the comeback work in game number 1, but they can't really translate that over to the rest of the series. Player of the series, though, very easy for me. It's going to go to Gumayushi. The only other player that you could even consider for this is KIA. This was a bot gap for T1, and I think that that's a very encouraging sign. Aiming has actually looked really good over the course of this split. Kellen is somebody who I have defended very regularly on this channel as one of the, maybe not best supports in the world, but like in that next tier down, you're like B+ B caliber supports. Like he is right in that conversation. Somebody you can absolutely get like 2nd or 3rd in the LCK with. You can absolutely go to Worlds with someone like Kellen in the support position, but Guma and KIA really stepped up today, and I think that's kind of been the biggest difference for T1 when you're looking at how they have played out a lot of this split. It's very funny because I think across the world we are seeing kind of a similar trend from a lot of different teams where we're seeing a lot of Ezreal and a lot of Ashe and a lot of Jhin and even things like Misfortune kind of rise in popularity. These bot sides that don't really need a lot of invested resources, either because they are already generally strong early like Misfortune and they don't really need a lot of gank assist in order to win the 2v2, or Ashe, Jhin, Ezreal, these champions that are hyper safe, that don't really need any sort of resources or assistance to be relevant in the mid to late game. We've really seen that, be the priority for most teams across the world, and for bot lane to kind of be weak side for most top teams, and that's just not been the case for T1. I would argue that this is the most they have ever played through bot lane, and it's just kind of an interesting time to do that. I think it's definitely worked out. Gumayushi has gotten quite a few Player of the Series awards over the course of this split. He's also gotten quite a few Dud of the Series awards. I think this has been his most consequential split as a starter so far, and I don't necessarily mean it's been his best. I mean, it's the one where I've noticed him the most. Typically speaking, Guma has kind of faded into the background for T1 over the past 3 years, not in a bad way, just in like he does what he's supposed to do, and he's not really asked to do a ton more than that for this team kind of way. But at least so far this year, he really has been the driving force either for or against T1. So it's definitely been interesting to watch. I think for the most part, he stepped up to the plate. The Jhin in game number 3 was phenomenal. I mean, I'm the biggest Jhin fan on the planet. It would seem Reddit and Twitter continue to try to convince people that Jhin is bad. I just don't understand. Jhin has been really good as long as the team plays around it well, and it was really good in this series. Guma was really good, but KIA definitely deserves an honorable mention, like a shout out as well. That Karma, that Renata, the Enchanters in particular in games 2 and 3 were excellent. He just controls lane incredibly well. He's one of the best 2v2ers regardless of role, whether AD carry carry or support in the entire world. He's able to just make sure that, players like Kellen, even if they're playing Lulu or Renata, they're just not able to have as much tempo, which is actually really difficult to do. Aiming, I think, had a much harder time just being consistent in the laning phase because of how good KIA was, and so big shout out to the bot lane. There are still some concerns with this team. I think Faker is still kind of a little off his game. I think he was definitely a lot better in this series than he has been in the last couple of weeks, but, Showmaker was also very off his game here, so it's kind of just whatever you want to take away from that. I don't think Faker was bad, just that I think it could be better, right? Owner and Zeus were solid. I thought Zeus in particular has really started to kind of turn things around. The mistakes are coming less and less. Now, the big problem for Zeus has been that he kind of struggles against players that are as good mechanically as him. Kingen is not one of those players. We've seen him struggle against players like Keen and Doran, players who are very good mechanically, and we'll see if that continues to track, but at least for this series, it was pretty solid when he was on these more aggressive picks. Overall, I feel good about T1. Again, they were definitely the better team in this series, and I think that's very encouraging considering just where they have been over the last few weeks. And for DK, I'm not going to freak out too much on this. I would have liked this to be a little bit more competitive. I think DK is really trying to push for a top 3 seed. I'm not sure that they are there after a series like this. They kind of feel like the 4th best team in the LCK. We all kind of expected T1 to be able to turn it around, and I'm certainly not going to call this an upset under any circumstance, but, we moved T1 down in the power rankings basically because we were forced to last week with how they had been performing. It's not a surprise to see them be able to bounce back here. For DK, though, again, their bot lane just got gapped a little bit. It wasn't just them, but I am going to give Kellen dud of the series. I definitely considered Kingen. I definitely considered Showmaker. I think one of those 3 probably should get it. All of them played pretty poor at different points in the series. I just thought Kellen's lack of agency in lane was more noticeable. Even if I do think that DK just around the map weren't exactly strong, Kingen didn't really do anything this series. Showmaker, while he did create plays, just didn't make some of the quote-unquote off-meta picks work. Twisted Fate is something that I've been pushing for in the mid lane all year long, and Silas I think is fine, but I don't think Showmaker was great. Even with Faker kind of underperforming mechanically in this series, I thought Showmaker was fine. Lucid, I think, has just kind of been the jungler where if the rest of the team is looking good, he's going to look good, and not really through any fault of his own. Sometimes the team just loses. I'm not going to blame him for this loss. Aiming also could have done more in the early laning phase, but he still is a phenomenal team fighter, and so you can live with that. Game number 1 definitely showed that off, but for DK, again, I just want to see the bounce back after this. If they become the team that is good enough to beat everybody below the top 3, that's going to be fine. That's good enough for them to make Worlds, but they do have to lock in that role, and they do have to be a bit more consistent than what they showed here. And then again, for T1, hopefully this is the start of a bit of a comeback. It doesn't exactly get easier from here in terms of schedule, but at 8-5, you're absolutely still in a position where you can walk out of the regular season in a pretty good space. And then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and it's kind of another upset, if you will. Another team with a worse record taking down a team with a better record. KT Rolster taking on Hanwha Life Esports, and KT Rolster is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. This is pretty insane. I'm not going to say this is entirely unexpected. That's what KT does, is they go out and they beat teams like Hanwha for absolutely no reason. They show up when they need to, but for HLE, this is the kind of series that you just cannot be losing. If you want to be the second best team in the LCK, which they absolutely do, they're on pace to do it, 10-2, obviously they feel like they can do. At this point, if you want that spot, you have to be able to consistently beat teams like KT Rolster, and to come out and just look bad, have some questionable draft decisions, get gapped in a couple of pretty particular lanes, it's not good. It's not what you wanted to see from HLE to start off the week, and it does add that sprinkle of doubt at the top of the standings of, is anybody really going to confidently claim that number 2 spot here in the LCK? But let's praise KT Rolster for a second. This team has definitely been on the turnaround. They started 0-4, really hard schedule, not a lot of really easy games to kick off their year, and ever since have kind of been on fire. 6-2 in their last 8 series is pretty damn good, and most of those wins have actually been, against decently good teams, and so you feel good about KT Rolster. I think they're getting better and better, and I think this team is learning how to play around some of their more inconsistent members a bit better, but I think the biggest change for KT absolutely has to be the consistency of the mid lane here. BDD is going to get player of the series for me, and he more than earned it here. Honestly, BDD in the last 2 to 3 weeks has been, part of that Royal Four again. He's really kind of put himself in that conversation. The problem is that basically everything else we've seen from BDD on tape over the course of this year has not been very good. When you look at the beginning half of summer, especially during their losing streak, but even, when they started to make things happen, it was Pioshik, it was Deft, it was Beryl, it was perfect to an extent. It wasn't BDD that was kind of carrying them back, and you look at Spring in particular, he was not good at all in the Spring during split. And so there are some reservations for me when it comes to BDD, just in terms of the fact of he's not been all that consistent over the course of this year. I think Zeka has been more consistent than he has, but there is no denying that in this series, BDD was light years better than Zeka. And so, you know, that's definitely an encouraging sign. Hopefully he's starting to get back on track, and hopefully you can start to expect some of those performances a little bit more consistently for him. He is kind of an anchor point for this team onto whether or not they're going to be able to accomplish what they want to accomplish, which is get to Worlds this year. BDD stepping up is going to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, determining factors in them actually doing that. Typically speaking, I talk about Pioshik and Beryl kind of being the swing points for this team. When they play well, they win. When they play poorly, they lose. And, you know, for the most part, they played well today. I think in particular, Beryl was really good of those two. I thought a couple of great engages on the Leona in game number 3 really set the team up for success. And, you know, I think that that's definitely a positive, but BDD, I think, has just as much sway. I also want to continue to praise Perfect. This guy's awesome, and I really hyped him up a lot going into the year. As somebody who does watch the Challengers League here in the LCK, I was really high on Perfect. I thought his tape was actually excellent. I went out as far as to say I thought Perfect was a better prospect than Thanatos. Coming into the year, I thought, mechanically speaking, I just saw more out of Perfect, and I don't know if I would, you know, continue to believe that. I mean, I definitely do with how Thanatos is playing in the LCS, but obviously very different circumstances. If they had switched roles, maybe Thanatos performs better. Who knows? But I will continue to say that I think Perfect is a great prospect, and I think he's actually done a lot of really good things for KT Rolster. He's been kind of a stabilizer on the top side. Deft is very, you know, feast or famine over the course of this split. He's kind of bought into the team identity, but he was really good in this series, and like I said, Beryl very good as well. But again, the swing points for me, Pioshik, BDD, Beryl, if they're playing well, this team's going to do just fine. If they're playing poorly, they can lose to anybody in the world. It's just how it is. And then for HLE on the other side, this again is not the kind of loss that you want to take. You got to feel very disappointed by this. I think there are definitely some draft concerns. Dud of the series is going to go to Peanut. The 2 Shyvana games are definitely not it. I get they might be limit testing a bit here in the regular season, and maybe this isn't something that they're going to do in high pressure, you know, playoff situations, but Peanut looked really bad on the Shyvana. He looked awesome on the Maokai, which makes it even worse, but he looked really, really, really bad on the Shyvana, and, you know, obviously even the commentators were making fun of it throughout a majority of this series. There's just not a lot to say. This is his worst performance of the split. Hopefully he can bounce back. Zeka also got pretty mega gapped in the mid lane. It just wasn't very close. He wasn't very competitive. The Tristana in particular in game 3 did not look even remotely on the same level as BDD's Corki, which is never a good sign. I don't think Viper and Delight played particularly well. Dorian was really good in game number 2 on the Gnar and not so good on the Aatrox in that third game. So, you know, there are some mostly minuses to take away from this for HLE, but again, it's all just about bouncing back. You know, one loss isn't going to tear apart this team. They're sitting at 10-3. They're so far above the other teams fighting it out for second place as we go into the back half of this split. What you can't do from this loss is let it get to you and let it bring you down and, like, start to have this snowball in a negative way out of control. You have to be able to corral it here, say it's okay. You know, we took some risks in draft. We misplayed a couple of, you know, laning phases. We'll be fine. We just have to be able to clean that up and we'll beat them next time. And then for KT, you got to carry this on. Like, you have to be able to stay consistent. The problem has never been their highs. It's been their lows. If they go out later on this week and lose to a team like Bro, none of this will have mattered. Sitting at 500 is not good enough for a team like KT Rolster. So while this win is great, it's never really been about their big wins. It's been about their big losses. So we'll see how this carries over. And then moving on to day number 2 and going from 4 potential and pretty clear playoff teams to probably the 2 worst teams in the league, we've got OK BRION taking on DRX. And DRX is going to pick up the victory here. They're going to win 2-0. And they're going to look pretty good doing it. I would say, obviously, this is more about Bro being awful than it is about DRX being good in any sort of way. But a 2-0 is nice, and I still think they have a couple of decent performers that would do better on other teams. I think they finally settled on their best 5, with Frog, like, seemingly being a full-time starter here in the top lane. He has gotten better and better week over week. Not that he's gotten great or anything like that, but he has certainly stabilized a bit in the top side, where Rascal was just getting worse and worse. And so I feel good about this starting 5, even if there are some concerns with, like, Sponge and Yehu not being particularly good in the middle of the map right now. But bot lane has been a huge positive. For Bro, they still can't really seem to settle on a starting 5. Samver was back in here in the AD carry role over Envy. You know, Envy's not been good over the past couple of weeks. He's been one of the weaker players in the LCK, period. But I would argue that Samver is probably just worse, at least in his current state. Maybe Samver has more upside. Like, honestly, I don't know who I would play because Envy does seem to be better at the current moment. But, like, Samver is, you know, somebody that you hopefully can get more out of later. I don't know. Either way, it's not good in the bot lane. Like, support doesn't help things. That clearly isn't going to make the situation better at the current moment, but we'll get to that in just a moment. For DRX, player of the series, it's going to go once again to Teddy. I'm a bit of a Teddy hater, or at least I've gotten that reputation a bit on this channel, not because I think he's an awful player, but because I think he's a lot closer to being, you know, a good player as opposed to being a great player. I don't think he's like this hard stuck player that deserves to be on a top 3 or top 4 team in the LCK. I just don't really see that for him. I think there are some clear flaws in his game in terms of his aggressiveness and his ability to be like the #1 option. You know, throughout his career, the big thing that he has always struggled with is that he is not the most I guess, decisive player in the entire universe. He is somebody who will sometimes just kind of play alongside his team. He's really good within structure, but doesn't exactly break structure. Like, he's not, you know, Jackie Love. He's not the guy that's going to go out there and just, if the team's losing, he's going to be the one to put him on the back and, you know, carry them across the finish line. He's going to do really well when the team is doing well, and maybe he won't be as proactive when the team isn't doing well, even if he individually has a lead. Sometimes he doesn't punish that or push that as hard as other AD carries will. But I do think that someone has gotten through to him on this DRX team. I don't know who it is. I don't know if it's a coach. I don't know if the fans finally just kind of got through to him, but he has been more aggressive over the last 2 or 3 weeks. My biggest problem with Teddy in the spring split was that, yeah, his KDAs looked good. He was doing well in lane. And then what happened to him? In the mid to late game, he would just disappear. He wouldn't be there anymore. He wouldn't die, but he wouldn't be dealing any damage. He wouldn't be stepping up and attempting to win fights for the team. You know, that lead was essentially pointless for him, and that's not really been the case here in summer. I would argue that this is clearly the best he has played in the last like 2 to 3 years at the current moment, because I've always just been a bit lower on his performances, specifically on Sandbox last year, where I did not think he was particularly good. And, you know, he's actually winning games for this team at the moment. We'll see how that can translate into teams that aren't Bro in later series, but at least for now it looks good. Everybody does know that I am a big Plata fan. I'm probably the biggest Plata fan, and so I definitely have to mention that he was awesome in this series and that he was a big part of why Teddy had such an easy time being able to run over things. The bot gap in this series was pretty massive. Yehu definitely stabilized a bit in the mid lane. That's huge. Sponge was really good in game number 1 on the Nidalee. He even won with the Shyvana in game 2, which apparently people think is impossible, even though it's happening all the time in the LPL right now. And then Frog was also really solid. Morgan has really struggled across this split. It seems like his mental has just kind of fallen off, and Frog was able to actually establish something here in the first game on the Jace, which I think is a good sign moving forward. Overall, DRX, not too bad. I mean, it's against Bro, and so you probably should expect a result like this, but for the 9th best team in the league, we could have seen worse, for sure. And then Bro on the other side, they're just bad. Like, there's nothing else for me to really say. This team is just not good. Whoever you want to give dud of the series to in the bot lane is kind of up to you. I'm clearly giving it to Polu. I thought Polu was just awful, and I continue to think that he is just a nothing in the support position for Bro. It's funny, because I was so low on effort, like I was so out, I've never really seen it in effort. I always thought he was a very overhyped player, and then Polu comes in, and I'm like, okay, well, at least you're going young. At least you're giving somebody an opportunity to grow with this team. And Polu, in terms of like current ability, might be worse. It's actually a very similar conversation, in my opinion, to Samver and Envy, where like, yeah, you know, it's a guy who hasn't had a ton of experience at this level, so maybe give him some time to get adjusted, and maybe he can get better over the course of the split. That's really not happened. He has just been awful over the course of this entire split. Samver also hasn't really grown, but he hasn't been given nearly as much time. He was also really garbage here. The bot gap was ginormous. Fate can't salvage this team. He's going up against his former org here, obviously, in DRX, and, you know, he tried his best to stay relevant. He wasn't really the problem here. Neither were Young-Jae or Morgan. I think Young-Jae in particular actually did some really interesting things across the map. You know, Morgan was very active. There were a lot of plays that were centered around the Gnar. I think this is far from his worst series of the split. I'll definitely just say that, but the bot gap is just way too large. These series are essentially unwinnable because of that. There really is just no way to overcome it. So Bro sitting at 1-12. I think this does officially eliminate them from playoffs. Not that that was ever really on their mind. I think they are now just officially out of it at 6-25 in terms of game score. One of the worst teams in any major region in the world, and I will continue to stick to that. And then for DRX, at least they're better than Bro. I don't think this gives me upside that they're going to get back to kind of the upside that they had at the beginning of the year, or that we maybe thought they could have going into the summer split here. They're just kind of a bad team, but at least they're not the worst team, as they proved here. And then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and it's another predictable outcome, if only because it involves the best team in the league. It's FearX taking on Gen.G, and Gen.G is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. They continue to only have 1 game loss on the split so far, being 26-1 in their first 27 games. FearX, to their credit, did put up a pretty decent fight here. I don't think that they were horrible. I don't think they got completely destroyed in either of these games. In fact, in game 2, they did have an opportunity, but they end up throwing it away with a couple of sloppy macro decisions, and Gen.G is just too clinical to let an opportunity like that pass by. Pays gets his Penta pizza stolen by Lehens and everything is very good for Gen.G outside of that. So there's really not a lot of analysis I can give other than to be positive really about both of these teams. I honestly don't think I walked out of this feeling worse about either. Obviously, I don't feel bad about Gen.G. They're 26-1. This is so clearly the best team in the LCK, and right now this is so clearly the best team in the world that there really is nothing to say. They have lost 2 best-of-3s all year long. One was on a trip halfway across the world in the middle of the regular season. I'm gonna excuse that one at least a little bit. And the other was against KT Rolster, who can beat literally anyone on any given day, but they're not gonna be consistent in any given circumstance. There is no reason to worry in any realistic way about Gen.G. They are just that dominant. FaZe is going to get yet another player of the series. You know, at the beginning of the year, I said it kind of was a 2-horse race at the top between Canyon and Peanut in terms of how I was feeling with the MVP conversation. The last 2 to 3 weeks have really just blown that wide open. FaZe, in my opinion, has absolutely taken the MVP lead here, and I don't even think it's particularly close. Honestly, he's playing even better than he did last summer, and I gave him my MVP last summer as well. So I feel really good about FaZe. He's just dominating all these fights. He's really good in the early game now, which is something he was struggling at, not only last split, but last year. You know, we were talking about potential sophomore struggles that he was having in the spring split. They have not been consistent. They have not carried over at all. He has been just fine. Canyon continues to be great, but Lehens was unbelievable in this series, and I really do want to shout him out. A couple of great plays to kind of save FaZe's mistakes, even in the early game. A couple of oversteps from him on the Lucian early on that actually got Henna into some relatively okay positions. Shout out Henna. We will talk about him in a second, but Lehens did a really good job to make sure that FaZe was allowed to survive some of those early mistakes and get to the part of the game where he is just more clinical, which is the late game at the current moment. Canyon, very good on Maokai, something that he's developed a lot over the time here on Gen.G. Chovy was awesome. He pulls out the Draven mid in game number 1. You know, we've seen this. It's ridiculous. It's absurd, and it absolutely should not work, but Chovy is so much better than everybody that he's going into that it honestly doesn't matter what he ends up picking in game number 1. And then Keen gets to pull out his signature Rise in game number 2. That's always fun, but not really a lot of analysis to give, quite frankly, in terms of Gen.G in this series. They played exactly as you would anticipate. They continue to dominate, and FaZe continues to absolutely steamroll some late game 5v5s where he's unable to kind of do that. So I feel really good about Gen.G, 26-1, 13-0. That should do it for you. And then for Fox on the other side, I don't feel bad about them at all, really, coming out of this series. I think that there were a couple of players in particular that actually really stood out to me in a positive way. Henna continues to actually look really good this split. I think this has been the best split of his career. I've always been a lot lower on Henna. I've just never really seen it when he was on Bro. It always felt like he was just a part of the machine, kind of very similar to what I was saying with someone like Envy or Samver on Bro now, where it's like, yeah, I mean, maybe you can make the argument that they would be better on different teams and different orgs, but it's hard to really take away from the gameplay that you feel good about that just because of the way things are going. Henna has gotten to a different situation now, and I think more importantly gotten a support that he gels with a lot better than he gelled with Execute, and things are working out. Duro coming in has really been a massive upgrade towards Fox, as I talked about not only last week, but ever since he's come in, he's been awesome for this team, and, you know, he tried to make some plays in this series, wasn't perfect, but I think the spot lane continues to be a strength. Closer also continues to not be a negative, which I think is a really big upgrade over what he has been the last year and a half. I know people will look at 2022 and talk about how good of a year he had and how much he broke out as an all-pro that split. I never saw it. I thought he was super overvalued there when Krako and Kale and Prince were doing all the heavy lifting for that sandbox team, but I think this might be one of his more consistent splits as well. I don't think he's really lost a lot of laning phases, even into Chovy. Now, he wasn't ahead in this series, and he didn't exactly win this series for FearX, but you're not really asking him to do that in these situations. You just need him to not lose, and that's kind of what he's been doing. You know, you do have to shout out the top side of the map. Raptor is going to get done of the series for me. He's Willer. Like, I know people are going to sit here and be like, well, they would have done better with Willer in here. Raptor and Willer are the same player. Like, Willer is definitely like a better version, at least by a little bit, but this idea that Willer would have come in and been more consistent, like, that's Willer's weakness too, is that in series like this, against teams like Gen.G, he looks really bad. That was always Willer's thing, is that, you know, he looked awesome and he was the primary carry when this team was winning, and he was often primarily the player that was losing the hardest when they would lose, and that's kind of the role that Raptor has filled. I continue to think that they are very similar, basically identical in terms of style, just a little bit different in terms of skill level. Clear also not particularly good in this series, but also wasn't really all that ineffective either, just didn't really get a ton to do until the late game where, you know, Fox was typically too far behind to actually really contribute. So I don't really feel bad about FearX in this series. There is a real shot that this is the 6th best team in the LCK, that they might make playoffs over the Kwangdong Freecs. Obviously, we'll see as we continue to move on in the year if FearX can kind of make that a reality with some of their wins, but this was never expected to be one of those wins, and for Gen.G, they just continue to steamroll along. Really not a lot of things to say. This team is the best in the world until proven otherwise. And And then moving on now to day number 3, our middle day here in the LCK, and we're getting back into our more, I guess, expected outcomes, if you will. We had Nongshim RedForce taking on Hanwha Life Esports, and HLE is going to pick up the 2-0 series win, and this just was a domination from Hanwha Life. This is them getting back on track after their unexpected loss earlier on in the week, and they look just about as good as you could possibly expect them to look in a series like this. It was all 5 members of HLE that really were dominant. I want to give a lot of credit to basically everyone involved. There was no one that did not stand out in a positive way for HLE, a team effort, and they just ran over both of these games. So very impressive stuff for Nongshim. I mean, they might be the best of the rest. They might be better than DRX and Bro and these teams that are really struggling, but that doesn't mean that they're a good team. Like, just because you're better than the 2 worst teams in the league doesn't mean that you're consistent in any phase of the game, and that absolutely continues to be the case here for Nongshim. They can't even determine which mid laner they want to continue to play, although for me it is a very easy decision in terms of what I would be pushing moving forward, but I'll get to that, you know, when we talk about Nongshim. But most of this team is bad. Like, you just have to live with that if you're a bottom tier team in the LCK right now. For HLE on the other side, player of the series was honestly really tough, because I actually just do think that everyone on the team played really well. I think a lot of people are going to point at Peanut or Doran or even Delight for player of the series here, and trust me, we'll get to them. They all played great. I'm going to give it to Viper. Was definitely the most standoutish. He ended game number 2, running 1,000 miles a minute on the Jin in that second game, but he was just awesome. His positioning is so good. His laning is so good. Again, I will continue to kind of push the narrative that he is just the most well-rounded AD carry in the world. He is the best all-arounder, the best jack of all trades, if you will, at the AD carry position in the world, and if you want to consider him the best ADC because of that, I think that that's fair. Do I think that he is the best AD carry in the world at really any phase of the game? Maybe not, right? Like, there are other AD carries that I would say are better in specific areas. I think Elk is the best laner. I think you could argue that at least right now, Pays is the better team fighter in terms of how things are going, but Viper is probably the most well-rounded in terms of all aspects of the game, and that's what makes him so effective, is he really just doesn't have a weakness as a player. He is, you know, elite at everything, and that's so scary to deal with. He basically made no mistakes over the course of this series. He had a lot of help. Big shouts to Peanut. You know, you want to talk about a bounce-back series after 2 games of Shyvana, this was it. The Vi, the Zyra, they both looked excellent. He was able to really dominate both games. His pathing was elite. I think generally the jungle control that he is able to exert when he's winning is just better than almost anybody else in the world, basically anyone outside of Canyon. There is nobody who just controls the game better than Peanut does, and I know that's a very vague sentiment, but in the sense of, like, eliminating the opportunity for Nongshim to even try and make plays, taking away their resources, you know, taking a situation where you're up 10 or 15 CS and, you know, you have a lot of map pressure, and using that to translate that into a 30 or a 40 CS lead by taking away, you know, jungle camps or neutral objectives. That's what I mean when I say controlling the tempo of the game, and Peanut does that better than basically anybody in the world when he gets to play from an advantage. He's so good at, you know, struggling those resources out of the enemy team, and it's really fun to watch. Zeka was awesome here, definitely a good bounce back, although, you know, mid lane was a bit of a disaster on the other side here. Delight was basically the second best jungler in this series in terms of moving around the map, especially in game number 1 on the Poppy. Doran was awesome, completely manhandled Mihail, and actually was awesome in the team fights as well. There really just isn't a negative thing for me to say about HLE. They were great here. And then for Nongshim on the other side, you know, they're fine. They continue to be exactly who we thought they were. They are better than the worst teams in the league, and they are nowhere close to being anywhere near the playoffs and competing with any teams in the upper echelon, and that was proven once again here. Mihail is going to get dud of the series for me. The Gnar, the Cassante, just not looking particularly good, got completely dismantled by Doran in terms of the 1v1. People will continue to clamor for Din Din. I think Din Din is also bad. I just think Mihail is also kind of clearly showing that he is not ready to play at the LCK level yet. Sylvie also just got completely embarrassed. I mean, just taken out of his own jungle. The Ivern could not play the game. There was nothing that he could get. He walked into his own jungle to see literally nothing, and he had 3 losing lanes. Like, this was about as disastrous of an Ivern game, both in games 1 and 2, as you could possibly get. You know, Jiwoo and Guger even couldn't save this one. Jiwoo's often been like a salvation player, I would say, generally for Nongshim, but I don't think he's been quite as dominant over the course of summer. I still think he's been good and definitely the best player on Nongshim, but it hasn't been quite as noticeable. Maybe it's just like a mental thing for him, or maybe, you know, he's just not as good as he was last split. That'll have to be kind of saved if he ever gets on a better team in terms of analysis, but Guger is also a significantly worse support than perhaps he's played with in quite a while. And then again, they just can't determine which mid laner they want to rock with in the mid lane, whether it's Fisher, whether it's Calyx. You know, I think Calyx has clearly proven himself to be better. He came in game number 2 and was definitely at least less of a problem on Tristana. You know, I don't think he's someone that I'm expecting to completely pop off for this team and change their trajectory, but Fisher is just not it. He has been given opportunity after opportunity in multiple different organizations and he's never been anything other than a bottom tier mid laner. And so at this point, I've basically completely given up on Fisher being even a league average mid laner. And so for Nongshim, I think the choice is pretty clear, but I don't think it's going to change their outlook either way. I think they're basically the same team regardless of whether you're playing a better or a worse mid laner. I think you're either going to win through bot and, jungle can have good games every once in a while, or you're going to have the jungler taken completely out and you're not going to be able to actually function. That's really the two sides of the coin for Nongshim. And then for HLE, this is a very good bounce back win after the KT series. I just want to see this get a little bit more consistent. If you can do this against teams that are better than Nongshim, even just like Kwangdong or, FearX, like if you can beat those teams as convincingly as you beat Nongshim and maybe even KT Rolster, like if you can go up in those matchups and dominate, that's when I'm going to start to feel really good about a potential Worlds winning team here in HLE. And then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and again, another pretty interesting matchup, potentially 2 playoff teams here with the Kwangdong Freecs taking on Dplus KIA. And DK does get their revenge from earlier this week with a 2-1 series win over KDF. This was actually a pretty decent performance from the Kwangdong Freecs. I'm really not all that upset by how things ended up going down for them. But this was a bit more of a statement win for DK, and they needed this. They needed to show that, very similar to HLE, they could come out and beat the teams that they are supposed to beat. I get it that T1 is, kind of tough competition. That's not exactly the worst loss in the world, but as long as you're able to maintain momentum, it's very likely you could be going into the playoffs as the number 3 seed, and let me promise you, the 3 seed is majorly valuable. Obviously, top 2 is very valuable, but there are 5, scary teams in the LCK. If you get that number 3 seed going into playoffs, all of a sudden things become a lot more interesting for you as a team. So 9-5, it's a pretty nice place for you to be to try to get yourself into the top 4, try to get yourself into that double elimination stage. That's really the goal here for DK. For KDF, again, I don't think they played bad, but aiming was just on one today. He's going to get player of the series. He's had quite a few of these performances over the course of this split so far. His KDAs have actually been genuinely outstanding. I think sometimes the gameplay is a little bit less impactful than maybe the KDAs would interpret, but I think for the most part, this series actually was phenomenal. He went out and actively was the one that they wanted to play through, and he wasn't just kind of a late game team fight merchant like he can sometimes be in terms of the kills. He was the one that they were, playing a lot of their offense through, if you will, especially on the Ezreal and the Kai'Sa. Obviously, the Ashe is fine, but it's such a stark difference what he can do when he has a champion in the late game that he can actually be, super aggressive on. It was really fun to watch. Aiming is one of those players that I don't really know how much I trust him at, the highest of high levels, at, the Gen.G or the T1 or the HLE level. Do I think that aiming's going to be able to go up against the best in the world and consistently pop off? Maybe not, but he beats these bad teams better than almost anybody, and that consistency is something that is super valuable for DK going into the second half of the year here. I also do want to give a massive shout out to Showmaker on the Tryndamere. What a crazy game number 3. I saw a couple of memes come out of this series, and come out of game number 3 in particular, where you have the Rumble, the Sedge, the Kai'Sa, the Rel, all just absolutely obliterating KDF and just dominating game number 3, and then Showmaker in a side lane just jamming out, solo laning, not worrying about anything. The rest of his team's winning 4v5s. It just doesn't matter. Very funny. Obviously, there are some interesting draft picks here. The Lee Sin top for Kingen in game 1, I think is a little bit less, risky. Even then, I think Tryndamere in game 3 is, still very playable. I think Trynd is actually in a pretty decent spot, and I think the mid lane meta is actually in a pretty decent spot to pull Tryndamere out in, so I'm not entirely stunned by the pick. I think it can definitely work, but Showmaker kind of proving that you do have to be a little bit away from the team in order to do that. Lucid was awesome here. He continues to have a kind of a re-breakout here in the summer split. I was very disappointed by his spring, but as I've said multiple times, he has been infinitely better so far in summer. It feels like that really good playoff run he had at the end of spring really awoke something in him, and he's carried that momentum over very cleanly. Kingen, Kellen, they were both really good as well. DK just looked solid. KDF, again, they didn't look bad. They just have clear weaknesses, and that weakness has continued to be the bot lane for this team. It's unfortunately almost the same situation that they were in last split with Bull, where they just can't really seem to find anyone that can stay consistent in that role. Leaper is once again going to get done of the series after an outstanding start to his LCK career in weeks 1 and 2. At the beginning here of summer, he has essentially been awful since then. He has been one of the weaker, if not one of the worst AD carries in the entire league since week 2, and it's just unfortunate. it's literally the exact same formula that Bull underwent last split where, oh, this new guy comes in and he reinvigorates this team as an upgrade to Taiyun, and this bot lane that was a complete disaster, and then slowly things start to get worse and worse as teams start to get a little bit more accustomed to them. The same exact thing happened to Leaper. Ondel is somebody who has been known to kind of have worse performances the longer he's been playing in a split, so there are real concerns here with KDF, I think, in terms of their long-term stability, but at the very least, they have other good players on this team. I think Bulldog and Cuz continue to be major positives for them. Bulldog has been very impressive to me this split. I think Cuz had a pretty good series here, a great Nidalee game in game number 2, and I don't think Dudu was a disaster. I think it's been proven at this point that maybe Cassante into Rumble isn't exactly super Cassante favored, and I still worry about teams, often electing themselves into that matchup, but I don't think Dudu's individual play was all that bad. He just couldn't do anything in that third game, but Cuz and Bulldog definitely kind of the core of this team, and they are good enough to make playoffs off the back of those two. They just need their bot lane to be, passable, and so far it just kind of hasn't been, at least over the last couple of weeks. And for DK, their bot lane has been very good. Aiming and Kellen are definitely strong. Aiming has been very consistent, especially against the bad teams, but, are they good enough to be able to compete against T1 and HLE and, Gen.G and teams like that? That remains to be determined. I still think that, Lucid's Explosion is very good for them. Showmaker's a solid player. This team is good enough in order to secure a top 3 spot here in the LCK. We'll just have to see if the upside is going to be able to carry them through. But then moving on now to day number 4, and day 4 definitely gave us the matchup of the week, at least on paper. T1 taking on Gen.G, and Gen.G is going to continue their dominance over T1 with a 2-0 series win. They are untouchable. I mean, genuinely, outside of the one game loss that they've gotten so far this split, they have genuinely just been untouchable. I don't even know what to say at this point. If T1 can't even break them down a little bit, game 1 was kind of close, but, if T1 can't even, try to match them, then I don't know who can. There is genuinely nobody in the LCK that I feel confident at all can even take a series off of Gen.G. That being said, they will likely lose at some point to KT Rolster just to complete, the mental aspect of that series, but Gen.G is just unbelievably dominant. There is almost nothing left to say at this point. It's everybody on the team. It's all 5 members that are playing like all pros. It's all 5 members that are playing like the best player in their role in the entire world. Gen.G is the best team in the world, and it's not particularly close. For T1, obviously, you feel bad about this loss, and I'm going to touch upon it here. Obviously, there's a lot of stress on this team, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen the viral clip of Faker. I'm not really going to talk about it too much. I feel bad for him, obviously, but this is kind of the thing with top-tier athletes. You see this in basically every single sport. That drive to win, especially when you're someone like Faker who's considered the GOAT, it can be immense, and sometimes that is really destructive for a player. I hope that he can figure things out mentally, and I hope that he can move forward well. I have all the faith in the world that he will be able to do that. He is clearly not somebody who will, sit there and just wallow away when his team is struggling. We've seen him struggle before for long periods of time, for years at a time, and he's always been able to bounce back. I'm not concerned about Faker. I know he's going to be just fine. He seems to have a good, team around him at the very least, but that's all I really want to say on it. I don't know Faker, obviously, individually, so I can't speak on, what he's feeling at the given moment. I'm not going to try and pretend like I know what's happening. It's obviously a disturbing video, so wanted to at least address it at the beginning of this. But for Gen.G, Chovy is going to get player of the series. I think one of the most under-talked about parts of Chovy's career, obviously he's the best player in the world, and it's not close right now. He has maybe made his way into the top 5 of all time conversation. I think that he's at least in the running. There are people out there that would call him the greatest of all time. I think that it's honestly not the craziest thing in the world. I don't know if we've ever had a peak quite like what Chovy is doing right now in the LCK, or at least we'll see how that ends out over the course of this year. If he runs through the rest of the LCK undefeated, if he goes and wins Worlds, this might be the greatest single season ever from a player. But one of the most under-discussed parts of Chovy's game is just how thoroughly he has always been able to beat T1. Obviously not as much on the Griffin days, although not really not on the Griffin days, but mostly here ever since he's come over to Gen.G. But even before that on Hanwha Life, DRX, he has always been a player that's actually just been able to beat T1, and it's really impressive to see how consistent he is at being able to play against Faker and being able to play against the way that T1 plays the map and just be able to take advantage of that the strongest way he possibly can, especially like he did in Game 2 here on the Corki. He is an incredibly impressive player, and at this point, there's just no other argument. He's the best player in the world, and it's not close. Pays obviously continues to go on a rampage. He is amazing within the structure of this team. I think he would be great without it. That's kind of the maybe difference in opinion that I have with some other analysts out there is I don't think he's as much a product of Gen.G as he gets credit for. He is just an incredible mechanical player, arguably top 1 in the world. Again, I think you can make a strong argument. He is the best team-fighting AD carry in the world. Like, I definitely think he's in the conversation. He's just so good in the front-to-back 5v5, but obviously playing with Lehens, who's able to set up a lot of these plays, helps. Playing with Canyon, who gets his Nidalee 2 games in a row, definitely helps. Keen looked really good on the K'Sante. He was definitely the better top laner in this series. There were a lot of factors that I think went in to this and ended up making Gen.G work, but Pays is paying it out and then some. Like, it's tenfold right now, and Chovy is the best player in the world, and so there's just nothing else left to say about Gen.G. And for T1, this isn't the worst loss ever. Obviously, you were hoping to try and regain some momentum this week, but I think you did that with the win over DK. I think that there is definitely a confidence booster there with that win, and hopefully a lot of that didn't go away with this loss, because I didn't expect this team to come in and win this. Like, my expectation for T1 is to clearly be the number 2 team. I think that is like their goal right now. Is I don't think they can beat Gen.G. I just don't think anyone can beat Gen.G at the current moment. Maybe I'm wrong. Hopefully I'm proven wrong, but I just don't know if that's realistic for T1. I think coming out here and saying, like, well, we tried, we kept game 1 really close, game 2 had a couple of good moments, you know, Guma ends up getting blown up at the beginning of the fight in game number 2, and they just can't win it. Like, that's fine. I think KIA, Owner, they were not necessarily the problem. Faker had a couple of misplays and, you know, just wasn't really on his game. He's definitely been a little bit more hit or miss. I think definitely the mental, you know, toll is starting to take on him in terms of his mechanics. It's not exactly the most consistent gameplay we've ever seen out of him, but we can figure that he's going to be able to turn things around as he always basically does in the playoffs, regardless of how he's playing in the regular season. But Zeus is someone I'm genuinely concerned about. Like, he's going to get out of the series. He's not been good this year. Like, he has just not been consistently good at all. He's been better, I would say, over the last, like, second half, but there are some games that he just gets destroyed in. And again, I want to reiterate what I said earlier talking about him in the DK series. When he plays against players that he is mechanically better than, he really is able to take advantage of their mistakes. It's why we saw him do really well against the Shy in World Finals. Not because the Shy is bad mechanically, but because Zeus takes advantage of mistakes very well. Players like Keen, players like Doran, they just don't make that many mistakes all that consistently, and it's why he has at times struggled to play against them in high-pressure situations. And so when you have, you know, Keen on K'Sante and he's just kind of doing his thing, Zeus isn't able to get those leads, and he goes into fights as Kennen and instantly gets blown up. It's just disappointing. I'm not really a fan of how he's playing games out right now, and I'm hoping he can get back his form. Again, another player who has at times struggled in the regular season in the past. I have been criticized mercilessly for saying that he's not like the best top laner in the world, not an elite level top laner, an A+, an A caliber guy. You know, go watch that LCK grades video. By the way, it's aged super well, but you know, I talk in that video about how Zeus is good, but not like the best in the world. He's an A- for me, and I got so much criticism, but this is the Zeus that I've always seen, someone who can be rather inconsistent, and I don't think this year has been entirely different than the career norms. I just think it's been a little bit more common than maybe it has in the past. So, you know, we'll see with him, but hopefully he can get back on the right track. For T1, again, I think they're going to be just fine. This loss might sting a little bit, but I mean, 2 losses to Gen.G, that's not going to hurt your resume all that much as long as you take care of business against the rest of the league. And then for Gen.G, 14-0, like 28-1, like what do you want me to say? They're the best team in the world and it's not close. Then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and again, another pretty predictable outcome and a pretty dominant series. It's FearX taking on DRX. And FearX is going to pick up the win. Kind of funny to say those teams back-to-back. The X's are strong in terms of the pronunciation, but, you know, FearX getting the job done, not entirely surprising. It gets them to 500 at 7-7. They're actually in a pretty decent spot to end up making the top 6. I think they are in there as of right now in terms of their record. I think, obviously, depending on what happens the rest of this week, things can switch around, and we'll see in the final standings where they end up, you know, landing after week 7. But, you know, they're in a pretty decent spot. 14-17, not exactly the best record in the universe, but this team has been getting better, and I think they have gotten significantly better ever since making the support change, and generally I think they're actually very scary to go into. And for DRX, you know, this isn't a shocking loss. You know, this team won earlier in the week, but it is against the worst team in the entire league in Bro. You know, coming out here, I didn't expect them to beat FearX. Maybe I expected them to be a bit more competitive because they really got run over in every aspect of the game, but we'll talk about that when we get to them. For FearX, player of the series was incredibly simple for me. It is going to go to Clear in the top lane. Now, I've been seeing some conflicting, you know, back and forth opinions on Clear individually as a player. What I'm about to say is going to really upset some people. and maybe not upset, but like confuse some people, considering my opinion on the player that I'm about to compare Clear to is very divisive. But to me, Clear is having a very similar split to what Bertle had last year for Sandbox, where he came in, especially in the spring split, and for the most part was really good, especially in their wins, was doing a lot of really positive things for the team when he was able to get priority and when he was able to face other top laners that weren't quite as good as him. He actually was able to dominate, and for me, Bertle was an all-pro in spring of last year, and I really did think that he deserved that kind of standing. I think Clear is in a very similar position right now where, you know, if you ignore the losses, if you ignore the games where, you know, FearX in general doesn't do particularly well, or when Clear is going into Keen or Doran or one of the better top laners in the league, if you ignore those games, then Clear is probably an all-pro caliber top laner, and I think that there is a real shot that he ends up making the all-pros for me at the end of the split. You know, the good games have just been better than they normally have been. I'm still a bit concerned about the game-to-game consistency and about the upside that is offered from somebody who really isn't all that good against the best top laners in the league, but there really haven't been a lot of standout top lane players over the course of this split, especially with some of the other players that would typically occupy some of those spots, like Zeus and like Dudu for KDF not looking particularly good. I think Clear has a pathway opened up for him to get into those. So we'll see at the end of the split, but at least for now it's looking good. The rest of this team was also very dominant, though. Raptor was the other player that I really considered a phenomenal game one on the Lee Sin. People are just taking advantage of this Shyvana pick at the moment. And, you know, there's just nothing else left to say. I understand that a lot of the community has turned on the pick. I'm getting there as well, trust me. I think in theory, Shyvana can work, but in practice and execution, it has clearly just been a bit of a disaster. We will get to that when we get to Sponge, but Raptor did a very effective job of just winning early and just never allowing the Shyvana to get to the part of the game where she's relevant. But the bot side was still great. Henna's had a great split. Like, I don't think like an all-pro caliber split, there's just too many good AD carries in the LCK, but man, this is the best split of his career, and I don't think it's close. And I don't think it's a coincidence that really all started to turn around once Duro came in the support position. This guy's awesome. He's so good at these engagers, and genuinely, I'm going to be so mad if he doesn't have a team next year, because that's just kind of how the LCK operates. There's a real chance that this guy comes in and, I don't want to say salvages Fox's season, but at least puts them kind of in a position where they could get into playoffs and then immediately gets dropped for like an upgrade next year, quote unquote. I'd be so frustrated because I'm really interested in this kid. I think he's really good at support, and so, you know, we'll see how that ends up playing out, but Closer continues to be solid in the mid lane as well. Really no negatives to give Fox. They absolutely obliterated both of these games, and really no positives to give DRX. This is the second, like, majorly dominant series that we've seen this week, and it follows a very similar format of just like, what do you want me to say? Teddy didn't die over 5 times in 2 games? Like, that's your takeaway? Teddy wasn't even particularly good in this series. It's not like he won bot lane. Like, game 1 and game 2, really, you have winning lanes, and you just weren't able to do anything with it. Like, Plata was awful. Yehu went right back to what he has been the last 2 weeks, which is a disaster. You know, Sponge played Shyvana and got completely run over, specifically in game 1, but the Ivern wasn't much better in game 2. Done of the series, though, is very easy for me. It's going to go to Frog. The top gap in this series was just ginormous. I don't know what trades he was attempting to make on the Gnar in game number 2, but they were not working out. Again, Frog his weaknesses are clear. I will continue to state that even though, you know, I think Rascal is worse, I'm not trying to say that Frog is great. He is a miserable laner. In fact, he's probably a worse laner than Rascal. He's just a passable team fighter, which is something that Rascal can't actually say. Frog is just so bad in the 1v1 in the top lane that it almost doesn't matter. His mechanics really aren't all that good. He's just a good decision maker, and he knows where he needs to be in a lot of situations. So when you go up against someone like Clear, who is like actively having a good season and a good series, like there's just nothing he's going to be able to do to be able to stop that. So, you know, DRX not good. Fox actually pretty good. They're sitting at 500. There is a real shot that they end up making playoffs, and especially with the momentum they've got behind them, next week is really going to be the telling one, because that's when they face KDF, and that's going to be the series that ends up making or breaking the rest of their season. And then moving on to our 5th and final day of LCK action here in week number 7, and man, who didn't see this result coming? I mean, truly, this is the expected outcome. It's KT Rolster taking on OK BRION, and of course Bro won. Like, truly, what did you want me to say here? Did you expect KT to beat Bro after they just beat Hanwha Life? Like, no way, dude. That was never in a million years going to happen. Of course, Bro came out and didn't just win the series. 1-2-0. Didn't drop a single game. They moved to 8-25. They get their 2nd series win of the year. And Bro, the moment that they get eliminated from playoffs, becomes the strongest team in the entire entire LCK. The tale is as old as time at this point. I mean, there is just genuinely nothing else left to say. For KT, obviously, you got to feel incredibly disappointed, but you can't be entirely surprised. I'm going to be honest, I know I have a lot of KT fans in my comment section. I respect you guys so much because I couldn't do it. Like, there's nothing in a million years that could get me to be a KT Rolster fan. I would lose my marbles on a weekly basis, so shouts out to the KT fans, but we'll go ahead and talk about this series. Player of the series for me, honestly, kind of difficult. Both solo laners were truly excellent here for Bro. But I am going to give it to Morgan. I thought he was a little bit more interactive in that second game on the Cassante. He was really good in both games, though. Morgan with a really nice and important bounce-back series. This is the best he has played in Summer so far by a pretty considerable margin. He really destroyed Perfect in Game 1 in lane and then destroyed the entirety of KT Rolster out of lane on the Cassante in Game 2. Just a very all-around performance. Excited to be able to say that. And then the other player that I really want to give a big shout out to was Fate in the mid lane. We didn't really talk about him in the previous series, but him coming in has made this team better. I know it doesn't feel like it because Bro has been such a disaster, but Fate really has been like the positive for Bro ever since joining the team. He is clearly still an LCK caliber mid laner. This is a guy who we were talking about as a top like 5-ish mid laner at his peak when he was playing for Africa like, you know, a couple of years ago. And so not surprised to see him come in and be good. It's just a bit wasted here on Bro, but I guess whatever opportunity you can get to stay in the LCK is probably the one that you should be taking. Envy was also back in here for Samver. This does feel like the better option for Bro if they want to try to win right now. I don't even know if I would make this decision. Again, even if Envy is the better player at the current moment, do you think that, you know, playing Samver could potentially give him some LCK experience and let him grow a bit more? Maybe that's the case. Maybe he would play him in scrims a little bit more often. You get to scrim against Deft and Gumayushi and players like that on a more regular basis that could potentially make him better. You know, that's certainly something that I would consider if I was Bro, because obviously this season is just doomed. There's no real reason to try to win games, but at least for now, they are going to put Envy back in, and he is going to, at the very least, be more stable. He was the better AD carry in this series, which is definitely strange. Polu was also pretty good here. This is one of the more consistent series that he's played. I think Young-Jae was solid, and I don't really have a huge problem with Young-Jae as a player. Don't think he's been the winner or the loser here for Bro. He's just kind of been along for the ride, but, you know, congratulations to Bro. It doesn't mean anything. They've already been eliminated from playoff contention, and it's not like they were ever going to be in the conversation in the first place, but it is a nice win in terms of mentality and in terms of just happiness, overall general happiness in the LCK. But for KT, I mean, again, who was surprised? This team had their biggest win since the Gen.G win in spring, and they immediately parlayed that into losing to the worst team in the LCK. Like, who is shocked that this is how this team ended up operating? It's the KT curse. There is genuinely no other way to describe it at this point. Dud of the game, or dud of the series, I should say, can go to quite a few different people. I considered Perfect because his game 1 was genuinely a disaster, but he was probably the only person attempting to do anything in game 2 on the Rumble, and I honestly don't think he played bad at all in that second game. I'm going to give it to Deft. He was the one who I thought really underperformed the most in both games. I just really don't like how he played. You're playing into Envy and Polu. If you can't win this bot lane 2v2, like, I don't really know what to tell you. And Deft, he's really embraced KT Rolster. That I will definitely say. We talked about Pioshik and Beryl kind of being the flippiness of this team, talking about how, you know, one game they're great, one game they're awful. Deft has very much joined them in that regard. He was not like this on DRX when they were like this. He was a bit of the kind of stabilizing calm force on DRX. That has not been the case so far for KT. His highs are crazy high, like some of the best in the league, and his lows are crazy low. It's just not the Deft that we've grown to love. I think in trying to win 2v2, you know, more directly in the early game, he has actually become just inherently more inconsistent. It's a more inconsistent style, and you're going to get more, you know, performances like this that are just not very good. Pioshik got out jungled by Young-Jae, especially in terms of pressure. Beryl didn't exactly do anything on Shen support in game 2. Like, BDD was generally fine, but like I said, Perfect was miserable in game number 1. There's just not a lot to like about this KT performance, and it brings them right back down to 500. And with this race for the number 6 spot, like, heating up, you know, they're not exactly in like a locked position. They moved to 17 and 18. They're below 500 in terms of game score. There is technically a world in which KT ends up missing playoffs. It's not very likely, but it is possible. If a team like, you know, if both KDF and Fox end up looking really good down the stretch, we could be seeing a world and an opportunity for, you know, those two to take 5 and 6 and for KT to be the number 7 team. Like, they have to step it up, and obviously they're capable of it. We saw that earlier this week, but performances like this, they're just too much of a disaster. You can't have things like this happen. And for Bro, obviously it's cool, it's great, it means nothing, but it's cool. I'm glad Morgan and Fate looked good, but, you know, the outlook of this team doesn't change at all. And then moving on to our final series of the week here, our second series of day number 5. And again, a pretty important one for playoff qualification. It's RedForce taking on the Kwangdong Freecs. And KDF is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. I really have to stress these game scores because they're becoming more and more important with how things are breaking down at the end. With KT especially losing that Bro series, they're sitting at 7-7. FearX is sitting at 7-7. KDF is now sitting at 6-8, one game behind them, but very much in reach if they're able to take down both of them, which they do play. I mean, they play KT and FearX down the stretch here of this race. It's definitely going to be an intriguing one to kind of see who gets those two spots and which team is left on the outside. But KDF doing their part here. Nongshim just not really all that much of a threat. I still think they're clearly better than the bottom two teams, if only because they put up some level of fight in this series, but some good things for KDF that I'm excited to talk about. First of all, player of the series, it's going to go to Ondel in the support position. It's really important for him to step up. He is an integral part towards the way that this team wants to play their game. And if he's going to struggle a lot, like he has been over the past couple of weeks, that's going to be a problem. But when you have good performances like this that really stand out in a super positive way where he's controlling the map, he's active early and he's active often, he doesn't stop pressuring in the mid game, he's just able to keep his foot on the gas and really just outpace Nongshim. When you see performances like that, all of a sudden it becomes a lot clearer why this team wants to invest a lot into him. He has been very good at times in the past, but the problem again with a lot of these players in the middle cluster of the LCK is just how inconsistent they can be. If Ondel can play like this, it's going to be fine. If Leaper can play like this, it's going to be fine. But the bot lane has been a bit of a concern against teams that actually know what they're doing. Nongshim's bot lane is kind of their strength, with Jiwoo actually being the best player on this team. We'll talk about it, but Vital coming in here to play support. We'll definitely talk about him. This shouldn't exactly have been a cakewalk for the KDF bot lane with my expectations, but it did go really well for them, so really happy to see that. They're going to have to pin that down and be able to keep doing that if they want to be able to maintain the position that they're in and make the playoffs. And then want to give a big shout out to Cuz as well in the jungle here. He was awesome this series, the Nidalee in particular in game 1. As we've seen from a lot of players this week, it turns out Nidalee isn't just a Canyon pick. It turns out it can work in a lot of different circumstances, and Cuz very much made it work here. Dudu was very good on the top side. Mihail was a disaster this week. We will get into that. Bulldog, very solid in the mid lane. KDF felt a lot more well-rounded here. It's never really been about whether Cuz and Bulldog and even to an extent Dudu can perform. Like, I think they're all good enough for you to be able to make the playoffs pretty comfortably. But Leaper and Ondel, they are the turning point for this team. They're going to need to be what steps up if this team wants to make top 6. And at least in this series, they were able to do that. But for Nongshim on the other side, I don't want to spend too much time talking about them. They did make a couple of substitutions. First of all, Fisher was playing in the mid lane. He's back and he played both games. Whatever, man. I don't really understand why he's doing that, but if you want to do it, then whatever. But the more interesting one to me is Vital coming in to play support. They really have not been able to land on a support over the course of this year. Peter was out for Guger at the start of the year, and Vital comes in to replace him here. Vital might be a familiar name to those of you who've watched the LCK over the past year or so. He's an AD carry, and he's played AD carry for this team for quite a bit. He role swapped to support at the beginning of the summer split, like just a couple of months ago in the Challengers League. And, you know, Nongshim's Challengers team is a disaster. They have a lot of things going wrong with them at the moment, but he's probably been the most interesting piece on that team. He's clearly very good mechanically. He's very solid in the 2v2. He's got a good head on his shoulders. I think with time, he could grow into a good support. A good support, he is not at the current moment. He's going to get out of the series here. I feel bad because, again, I honestly think in like a year, this could be an upgrade. Like, he just has a lot of instincts for the position that I think a lot of other supports could kind of grow into. He's definitely an interesting piece. I always liked him as an ADC, even if I didn't love him. I don't think he's better than Jiwoo or anything, but, you know, he was always someone that I could functionally see working at the LCK level at like a Henna caliber player, like a Leaper caliber player, right? But it just didn't work here. He was constantly outpaced by Ondel. The support gap was just a little bit too large for him to overcome. Top lane has also just been an absolute disaster for Nongshim all year long. Whether it's Din, whether it's Mihail, both of them have been really bad. And even at this time, I can't even say like, oh, at least we got the Dudu Din matchup. We didn't even get that. We got Mihail getting absolutely blown away on the top side of the map. He was awful this week. Sylvie wasn't particularly good this week, although he really hasn't been the biggest issue for Nongshim. He's often their most important piece in their wins. Fisher's nothing in the mid lane. Like, where is Calyx? We just need to see him consistently at this point. But for Nongshim, there's not really a ton of expectation for me. They have the same record as DRX, even if I do think they are the better team. There's really not a lot for them left to play for. Technically, I guess they're not eliminated if everything were to go right, but functionally they are, and, you know, I think that they have continued to play as if they are. And then for KDF on the other side, like I said, this bot lane is going to determine whether or not this team makes playoffs or not. I think they absolutely can. They have enough firepower to get back into that top 6 like they were in spring, but they're going to have to get more consistent, and that definitely starts with the 2 players in the bot lane. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK week number 7 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. Up on the screen, the updated standings after 7 weeks of action. Some teams are highlighted. We've got 3 different colors now up on the screen. Gen.G, of course, with the asterisk, they've qualified for Worlds. All they had to do was qualify for playoffs because they won MSI, and they've already done that. But not only have they done that, they have locked themselves in with a top 2 seed. At 14-0, there is literally no way that they can finish below 2nd place in the LCK for the rest of the year, so they are guaranteed a round 1 bye in the LCK playoffs, which is pretty nice. HLE joins them in the playoffs by locking in their spot. They are the only 2 teams, though, that are technically officially locked in for the playoffs. You can imagine DK and T1 will be along for the ride and very close as we continue to move on, but those other playoff spots very much still up for debate. You know, KT at 7-7, Fox at 7-7, KDF at 6-8. You know, we'll talk about that in a second, but like we said earlier, our first team has officially been eliminated from playoff contention, that being Bro down at 2-12. DRX and Nongshim are likely going to join them very soon as well. They're not good, and Bro being out of playoff contention is certainly not a surprise to anybody. But let's go ahead and go over my power rankings. You can see them in the power rank column from number 1 to number 10. Change is how that has changed from last week to this week. We can go over risers and fallers. Top 2 are going to stay the same, at least for now. HLE did lose that series that they really had no business losing against KT Rolster. I would really like to see them, you know, just strengthen their consistency, but at least for now, I still do believe they are the 2nd best team in the LCK, at least until T1 figures things out. They are going to move back up to 3 because they did beat DK, and I feel pretty good about that, but until they show they can beat Hanwha Life, at least consistently, I'm not really going to believe it. This team has a severely losing record against HLE over the course of this year so far, so we'll see how that ends up playing out, but at least for now, I have to leave them at number 3. KT is going to stay at number 5 regardless of their loss to Bro. I still think they have the most upside of all of the teams, you know, in that cluster in the middle of the standings, but I am going to change my number 6. It's going to be Fox. I think they're better right now, quite frankly, than KDF. I just don't really trust the KDF bot lane going up against anybody that isn't one of the worst teams in the league, and I'm just not sure how that's going to play out. FearX, I think, is a more complete and well-rounded team, and especially with the addition of Duro, with Clear kind of stepping up over the course of this split, I think they have a lot going for them, so they're going to stay in number 6 for me. KDF will fall down to number 7, but it's very fluid. They could definitely move as the weeks continue on, and we will have a better idea at the end of next week. That is for sure. Nongshim going to stay at 8, even though the O2 week. DRX at 9, Bro at 10. I don't really feel like I need to explain that all that much. Quite frankly, if you wanted to move them around in any way, I'm not going to care all that much. They're the 3 worst teams in the league. Whatever order you want them in, I think, is generally fair. But those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. But it's time to move into my player of the week and my dud of the week here for week number 7. Player of the week, another familiar face. It's going to be Pays. This is the 3rd player of the week that he's gotten. He got it week 1, got it last week in week 6, and here he gets it again in week 7. This guy has absolutely skyrocketed his way to the top of the MVP conversation, and I don't think anybody is really arguing that right now. If he maintains this pace, it's not even going to really be all that close of a conversation. He's just absolutely torn up the LCK. His teammate Chovy is going to be one of my honorable mentions, my runner-up here. He was just amazing in that series, specifically against T1, although he's been great throughout the entire year. That's not shocking anybody. And his opponent in that series, Gumayushi, is actually going to be my other honorable mention, my other runner-up here. I thought he was genuinely tremendous for T1 this week, regardless of the fact that they ended up losing to Gen.G. I thought he actually played really great. So Guma and Chovy are going to be my honorable mentions. Pays, though, is going to get my player of the week. And then my dud of the week, pretty obviously, is going to go to Mihail, the top laner for Nongshim. That position has been a black hole for Nongshim. Not that that's the only one. Mid lane has also been a black hole for them, but they just can't find anybody who's even serviceable on the top side of the map. Din was a bit of a disaster, at least in terms of consistency, and Mihail has certainly not made it better, even if his best game is probably better than Din's best game at this level, so I don't really know what to say. You know, Mihail clearly isn't the answer, but they don't really have a lot of options at that position at this point, so Mihail's going to get dud of the week, and Pays is going to get player of the week, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LCK on this channel, we post about all 4 of the major regions. That's the LCS, LEC, LCK, and the LPL, and with playoffs coming up, not only for this region, but for all the regions, you're gonna wanna stick around. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all